Welcome everyone to the latest episode of a series I like to call History Speaks. Today in the show we have a children's author who has set the standard for diverse books for children, including her own award-winning story. She is passionate about Black history, especially in the times of the Tudors, and has some fascinating insights into that period. She balances a busy career in marketing with a passion for writing and often finds inspiration in the moments between parenting. So please give a warm welcome to my guest today, Claire Linney. Hi, Claire. How are you?
I'm cold, is why I've got a nice thick jumper on, but otherwise I'm very good. Thank you.
It is chilly, I must admit. So I always ask my guests something that could be considered a little off the cuff. So in your case, as a writer of time travel, which period of history would you consider a great time to visit?
Oh, it's quite a difficult one for me to say because I feel like some of the periods of time I would like to go back to, someone that looks like me might not have the best time from a time travel perspective. But I would love to go back to the Victorian times. I think mainly because the sequel to my book is set in Victorian Leeds. And it's about a circus owner called Pablo Fanque, and I've got very into research on the Victorian circus. So that is the time period I would love to go back and visit right now.
It's a good a time period as any, I guess, isn't it?
Yeah, so, I mean, the air quality would be terrible,
yeah.
But yeah, we'll bypass that. Pretend that's not a problem.
You've got to imagine it's a world where everything is beautiful.
Yes.
You know what I mean? No smog, no illness. It's just you going back to that period of time and just having and just enjoying it, really.
Yeah, that would be lovely.
That's what you're going to do. So, as I ask all the guests that come on there, how did you first become interested in history and what is your background?
So one of the things I frequently tell or ask kids to guess when I go and do author visits is what my favorite subject at school was, because it wasn't history, which they always think it is, history or English. I didn't particularly like history at school. So my knowledge of history was very, very sketchy, I think, until quite recently. And then when I was on maternity leave, I discovered a book called Black Tudors by Miranda Kaufman. I can't remember how I came across it or how I ended up reading it. And I just found it absolutely fascinating because that wasn't the history I was taught in school. There were no Black people in any of the history that I came across other than enslavement and Windrush. That was sort of the only narrative. And it really captured my imagination. So that kind of sent me down a wormhole of just reading more books about Black British history and also finding out what books were available for kids in that space. So I think that has ignited my love of history. And then I've sort of got into side research pieces on different eras because of the writing. So yeah, it's been something a love of history has been something I've come to quite late in life. I mean, I'm now in my 40s. It's taken me a long time to get there, but yeah, I'm really enjoying it now and also exploring more, I think, historical fiction as a result as well.
I guess understanding your journey provides a valuable context for your work, and it's clear that your passion has led you to uncover stories that often go untold. So shedding light on voices from the past that are really rarely heard. Your work centers around the more obscure Black people of the era. So how challenging was it to find out about them?
I think it's been made easier because there are very, very brilliant historians who've gone before. I mean, I am not a historian and I would never claim to be a historian. I'm an enthusiastic amateur. And I think a lot of the work in igniting the idea for my writing came from Black Tudors. So it came from the work that Miranda Kaufman had done, and she was building on work of historians before her. But there was a huge amount of detail about the life of sort of 6 particular Black Tudors in her book. One of them was Reasonable Blackman, who I think I was drawn to because he was just kind of an everyday bloke. That's, he was a tradesman. There was, he wasn't necessarily changing or challenging the course of history. He was just part of life. And I think that's almost why I gravitated towards his story, because he was quite unremarkable. But I love that we have found a tantalizing record of him that still exists. So I think if it hadn't been, and 10 years ago, I don't think I could have written the book I wrote, because I would have had to have done the job that the historians have done. And, I don't come from that sort of place in academia, but I think because there are people like Dr. Miranda Kaufman who have, started to tease out those stories from the historical record and build out the narratives, that was sort of the foundation for me being able to take that fact and then spin a fictional narrative around it.
I mean, I guess uncovering the lives of lesser known figures must have been rewarding. And especially when bringing these stories to life through your own writing. Now, your book, Time Tub Travellers and the Silk Thief.
Yes.
It's a mouthful, isn't it? It does centre on a part of London where your main character lived and worked, and you've already mentioned him. So what could you tell us more about the Reasonable Black Man?
So Reasonable Black Man, he's sometimes given the moniker as I can't speak either, Britain's first black tradesman. He probably wasn't, but he's, I think, one of the first black tradesmen we can kind of find evidence for in the historical record, which I particularly loved. But he was a silk weaver. So silk was quite fashionable at the time. So Queen Elizabeth I, for example, loved silk stockings. And we know obviously royalty had the ability to set trends in fashion. So silk was becoming more and more popular. And it's believed that he came to London from Holland. And there were quite a lot of silk weavers. So there was quite a lot of expertise in Holland at the time. So he would have brought that expertise to London and settled in Southwark, which was quite common for a lot of immigrants at the time. So it's around the period in Tudor history where the city of London was quite heavily regulated. There were very kind of strict guardrails around how much you could charge for goods and services and trades. But if you settled in Southwark, you were outside the city of London. So that's why theatres like the Globe Theatre and the Rose were built in Southwark. I like to think it was maybe a little bit more squalid and sketchy than the City of London, but you could get away with more things, whether that be theatre or brothels or in this case, setting up a silk trade. And we don't know for certain, but there's some evidence to suggest that maybe Reasonable Black Man called himself reasonable to indicate his prices were reasonable or more reasonable than the City of London, for example, to sort of get himself business. So I particularly love that nugget about him as well.
It's a very strange name, isn't it? Reasonable. I mean, whether it was something people gave him, because it doesn't sound like his parents would call him reasonable.
No, and I think it wasn't unusual at this time for people to sort of take on nicknames that were connected to their trade or their personality. So, for example, one of the other characters in the book is called Red Arthur because he has red hair and a red beard. So that was something that wasn't uncommon in Tudor times, apparently. So maybe he was given the moniker Reasonable. It'd
be like having a butcher and his son working together, wasn't it, and calling him Butch Cassidy and the Sundance.
Yeah.
But, it sounds as silly as that. Would this guy have originated from Africa originally and moved up through Europe before settling in Holland?
Yeah, so we don't know. So interestingly, this is before Britain really got involved in the transatlantic slave trade, but Spain and Portugal had started to sort of bring people over from Africa to their colonies. And also, so Spain and Portugal had a much bigger sort of native African population. And then also Holland was starting to get in on the act, but it was kind of before Britain really jumped wholesale into the transatlantic slave trade. So it might have been that he came from Portugal or Spain originally, or he might have come from a Dutch colony, but we don't know that much about his origins. That's sort of shrouded in mystery, but it was probably likely to be through one of those two countries.
I guess exploring the life and the work of him, it offers such a rich connection to the past. And it's fascinating how your book brings these historical moments to life. So the title of your book suggests time traveling, as we mentioned earlier.
Yes.
Was this always a title that you thought would register with young readers, given kind of an air of excitement? And what could be found if you did, manage to look back in time?
I think I always knew I wanted to write a book that sort of brought the history to life. I think the reason I wanted to make it a time travel book is partly because I love science fiction and fantasy. Like that's that's the genre I always gravitated to and I really loved when I was younger. And it was knowing that I would never have read a history book when I was this age because I would have thought that someone was trying to teach me something. So I really liked the idea of being able to get kids to explore history, but through a modern lens with kind of modern eyes. And I think it's time travel as a device enables you to do that. So much in the same way that sometimes people leave the normal world and enter a fantasy realm, and then everything is sort of explored through, these new eyes. Actually, time travel allows you to do the same thing with history. So I quite liked that idea of maybe helping kids to connect with it because they were also experiencing the strangeness of it as the same time as the protagonists were. So that's why I wanted to do time travel. And I just love a bit of alliteration, I think, in a kid's book. So I think that's where, I think originally it was going to be something like Rainbow Tub. It was going to be called Rainbow Time Machine or something like that, but it sounded a bit too much like Hot Tub Time Machine. And I was like, that's not what I'm doing here. So I think it eventually changed to Time Tub Travelers.
I think you might have struggled getting that into schools if you'd called it
Possibly.
Hot Tub Time Machine.
Yeah.
Anyway,
exactly.
we'll leave that one to one side. But I guess, it must have sparked curiosity and excitement in the children and offers, I guess, a creative way to engage young minds. So beyond the storytelling, it raises an important point about how history itself is taught and understood by kind of younger generations. So for yourself, how important is Tudor and Black history in the education of children today?
I always find it interesting which, I guess, time periods seem to hang around in the British curriculum. So that, there's always a couple of tentpoles, and Tudor history definitely seems to be one of them. And I do think there's a lot about it that's interesting. It was the time of William Shakespeare. It was the time of Elizabeth I, who is, one of our most famous queens. And I feel like Henry VIII maybe unjustly gets a lot of poster time in the British curriculum. Because when I ask kids, when I go and if they haven't started learning the Tudors yet, and I sort of say, what do you know about Tudors? I'll always get, Henry VIII, and didn't he have a lot of wives, and didn't he cut the heads off some of them? Just seems to be an enduring narrative that we're sort of passing on to the next generation. But look, I think Tudors it's a really interesting time. I think because it's the time of Shakespeare as well, I do think it's a fascinating time period to dive into. I think, however, and I think one of the reasons I never connected with it at school is I'm much more interested in the kind of day-to-day minutiae in history. So one of the things I loved learning about was like how bad Tudor London would smell. That sort of, people arrived from abroad and would just write letters home describing how terrible the smell was. And the fact that I found out a lovely fact that the wherries, so the boats that used to ferry people across the Thames, quite often use pigs' bladders as life jackets. And I think it's actually those details that certainly when I was a kid would have really captured my imagination. Henry VIII doing terrible things to 6 wives wasn't, for me, wasn't as interesting. So I think sometimes it's the little details that can really bring it to life for kids, because it just kind of surprises them and captures their imagination. And I think in terms of Black Tudors, I think when I reflect on the fact that I grew up with such a oversimplified narrative of the history of Black people in this country, of enslavement and Windrush, and then sort of an allusion to Africa as kind of a dark continent, the idea that actually Black people were just part of the fabric of everyday life and have been for hundreds of years just really transformed the way I saw Black history of this country. And I think that in turn, changes the way you look at our diverse culture and communities today. So I think it's really important that children understand that there is more to Black history than just enslavement. And then this idea that suddenly everyone just arrived with Windrush. Windrush is really important, but it's not the start and it's not the end. So that's the bit that I think needs to be more integrated into the history curriculum in schools, because it's not required. It's still up to individual schools whether they include Black British history in the curriculum or not.
There was a program I watched. It's years ago now. I can't remember what it was called. It was a documentary of some sort. And they said the origin of life quite possibly began in Africa. And
Yeah, so I'm a biologist by trade.
kind of spread. So,
Yeah,
I mean, I don't
they
know.
talk.
Sorry.
Yeah, no, so sorry, this is my biology side getting all enthusiastic. I studied biology at university. So yeah, we're all descended from an individual known as mitochondrial Eve. And there's, I think, an overwhelming weight of evidence now when you look at the DNA trees of all human life. Life started in Africa, and actually lighter colored skin was an environmental adaptation. So basically, you know, because human life evolved in Africa, we needed to protect ourselves from the sun. So we had a lot of melanin in our skin. So we were black essentially. And then as populations migrated north, they needed to get more vitamin D from less sunlight. So there was a bit of a trade-off of the lighter your skin, the more vitamin D your body can absorb despite the low light. And you don't need as much protection from the sun because it's not as fierce, so that you can basically support having lighter skin. And that is essentially how different skin tones evolved. But I think that often gets lost because there's such a construct around race, and it's, you know, it has such an importance in societies today, but it's, you know, that's just how it evolved over time. But yeah, we all came from Africa originally.
Yeah, I just remember that. I don't know where, still can't remember where I saw it, but it's a few years ago.
Yeah.
But moving on, it's no surprise that your work has been recognised and also had prestigious accolades. Now, your book has earned you honours, including the Ink Book Prize Awards, in which you won the Best Debut Novel. So how did that make you feel?
That was amazing. I think also is because I'm a self-published author, and yeah, just sort of winning awards wasn't something that I thought was going to happen. I thought, and actually a lot of awards you can't even enter if you're a self-published author. So yeah, it was a really nice recognition, and a really nice endorsement. And I think, you know, as a children's author, I don't think anyone starts writing books for kids for the fame or the money. To be really honest.
I think that's the same for any author. I don't think anybody sets out thinking I'm going to be, you know, the next whatever. But
yeah, there are definitely quicker and easier ways to earn money. I think you write because you're passionate about it and you love it. But I think, you know, when, you know, getting an award is just, it's a really lovely feeling. It's a really nice recognition, I think, of all the work that goes behind the scenes. So yeah, it was fantastic.
How long did it take you to do it then? Or where did the original idea come from? And how long did it then take you to get to the point of publishing the book?
Quite a long time. I made the disastrous choice to start writing the book after when my son was very small, which was a terrible life decision. So I read Black Tudors on maternity leave. And I had no intention of being a children's author, but the idea of being able to sort of bring some of this Black history to life in a fictional, fun way for kids just became a bit of an earworm. And I kind of ignored it for months, but it was almost sort of just, I don't know, like germinating in my brain. And eventually I was like, I need that headspace back. So I started writing it down almost just to get it out of my head. And then it just sort of kept evolving. And then I think after about a few months of doing this, I was like, okay, if I'm doing this, I'm doing it. But it probably took 4 years from starting to write it to getting it published. And a lot of that was, you know, COVID happened. I had a toddler. I still had a full-time job at that point. So it was just trying to find gaps and times to sort of to work on it. So it's sort of been a little and often over quite a long time to eventually bring, and it evolved and changed a lot because of feedback and, you know, children reading it and giving me their feedback. And so, yeah, it's evolved a lot from the early versions, but yeah, it was quite a long process.
Have you, I've not seen the book. So is it, there we go. Is it illustrated at all?
It's not illustrated. I would love to have had it illustrated. It's not required for this age group. It's sort of, you know, 7-8-year-olds to 11-year-olds. You do get illustrated books, or books with sort of maybe like 8 or 9 illustrations in for this age group. My budget didn't quite stretch to that, but yeah, in the future, there's a very lovely girl, Onyinye Iwu, who does my cover artwork. And yeah, if I have a bit more money for future ones, I'd definitely like her to do more illustrations because I think that would be wonderful.
It's a testament to the impact of your work, but it's clear that your passion also extends beyond your own writing. Now, you not only promote your own work, but also other authors' stories. So how do you gauge inclusivity into books for children today?
I think I see it in two different ways. So when I compare it to when I was at school, so I grew up in the 80s, and I mean, there were very few, if any, Black and brown authors of children's books. There were very few queer authors or neurodiverse authors. So, a lot of the authors I grew up with were sort of, a lot of them were dead actually, or quite old at the time. So compared to that, it's fantastic how much diversity there is when you look at the type of people writing children's books today. Having said that, it's not anywhere near where it needs to be. I mean, if you think about the fact that over a third of primary school kids in this country are Black and brown, that is not reflected in a third of the books that they would find in the library, or they would find in a bookshop. So I think there is an awful lot of work that still needs to be done. But I personally find it, really encouraging and really positive that there are so many incredible authors to find now. I just wish I had an actual time machine so I could send all these books sort of back to 9-year-old me. But yeah, so so I think things have come a long way, but they need to go a whole lot further.
You think, so I'm guessing then the children today, I don't have kids in school or anything like that, but what kind of books are they still showing them then? Are we going back to Dickens and things like this? And
so I think there's a lot of classics still come up. So, things like the Narnia books are still really popular. Roald Dahl books are still really popular. So I think, and I have mixed feelings about children's classics. I grew up with a lot of them. I love a lot of them because they're really nostalgic for me. But, unless you are thin, white and middle class, you're not seeing yourself represented well in most children's classics. And I do think sometimes they're put on a bit of a pedestal as sort of the epitome of great children's literature. And actually, having read all those classics growing up and now reading the children's books that are being published for kids now, I think there is better children's literature being written now, certainly more diverse, certainly more inclusive, but just better fundamentally than a lot of those children's classics. So I think a lot of schools work really hard to make sure that their libraries and their book selections are representative of the cohorts they represent. So I think, there are people that are doing amazing work in this space to give kids, a really amazing breadth of books to choose from. So, but I think there's still an over-reliance, especially in publishing. I don't think it's diverse and inclusive enough. The publishing industry certainly isn't. And there's a lot of children's authors that really, celebrity children's authors that also really dominate that space that I would say don't necessarily represent the best of children's literature, but certainly represent the biggest of the marketing budgets. But that is a whole other can of worms.
Yeah, I was just thinking, so your book, for instance, would that ever be considered to be put onto a national curriculum? The teaching?
I don't know how it gets chosen. So actually there's a brilliant author I've recently discovered, who's been around for years called Catherine Johnson, who is a mixed race author who's been writing historical fiction books for kids for probably about 10 years. One of her books, Sawbones, I think is it's on the curriculum as the sort of year 7, year 8 recommended reading. So I think those things get revised. I do think there's a lot of work that needs to be done in decolonizing the curriculum. I'd love to think that this government would make Black British history a required part of the history curriculum. And then who knows, maybe there is an opportunity for my book to become one of the ones that's recommended. I definitely know from going into schools that there are teachers who've used it as kind of a fictional text whilst they're studying Tudors to kind of give the kids a different experience of Tudor Britain and to work alongside the sort of history curriculum. And that's worked really well.
Yeah, I can imagine.
Who knows?
I think that would work really well because it, like you say, it brings together Well, it brings together race and everything, so just to make it a more level playing field, I guess, which is what's really required, I guess, in today's classrooms.
Yeah.
Because as you said, there's how many, I don't know, so many thousand black children around today, black and brown children who've not got access possibly to the book you're writing or any others. They're just being taught the same old things that go back years and years and years and years. And really that's quite wrong because it should change with each new generation coming through. But
I think and things are changing. I just think not fast enough and maybe not consistently enough. And I think especially given the, diverse makeup of Britain today, I think it's really important for all children that they have a full picture of history, which includes, Black British history, because, it says so much about the society that we have now, where those origins are. So yeah, I hope things do continue to move and change.
I do. Promoting inclusivity in children's literature is vital work. I think we understand that. And it's inspiring to see how you brought these stories to life. Now, it makes me wonder about the other historical figures who might inspire you in future projects. So are there any other Black characters from history, not necessarily from the Tudor period, who you'd like to write about?
Yeah, so my absolute favourite is Pablo Fanque, who was Britain's first Black circus owner. So he is immortalised kind of obscurely in a Beatles lyric for the benefit of Mr. Kite, which came from a poster of his circus. But he was, I guess, I feel like he needs the Greatest Showman treatment if you've seen that film, because he was one of the biggest names in circus in the Victorian age at a time when circus was sort of the biggest form of entertainment. And he was known as a master equestrian. He studied under Andrew de Crowe, who was one of the most famous sort of equestrian performers of the age. And he was so popular that even though he'd sort of descended into bankruptcy by the time he died, 10,000 people turned up to his funeral, which I think is amazing. And every time I tell kids that story, because especially when I sort of introduce them to a couple of other Black historical figures, it's always Pablo Fanque that they remember and they're really engaged by. So the sequel to Time Tub Travelers is going to be set in Victorian Leeds, and it's set in the circus of Pablo Fanque, because I just think his story is so fascinating and so interesting. And there's so much more information about him because people wrote newspaper articles. There are posters about him. A clown he performed with called William F. Wallet wrote an autobiography which talks a lot about Pablo Fanque. So we can really find out so much about his life, which is wonderful.
So I guess he must have been one of the original traveling circus owners in the UK then at that time.
Yeah. So when he started, there were about maybe 8 or 9, maybe 10 kind of big names that traveled around. And at that time, it was before tent circuses came in. So circuses were largely performed in kind of purpose-built amphitheatres.
Oh.
But he was very popular in the north of England. So we kind of tour around a lot of the northern towns and cities. I think by the time he retired, or sort of was forced to retire, circus had become a lot more cutthroat because you not only had these big companies coming over from the States, but these sort of big tent circuses would travel round. So it did get a lot more competitive as sort of you get into the late 1800s. But yeah, at one point he was one of the biggest names and one of the best known for sure.
I wonder if you ever went to Sheffield then, because that's where I'm originally from.
Definitely went to Sheffield. So my book's set in Leeds, but I mean Sheffield, Leeds, Manchester, Bolton, and you can see from a lot of the circus posters, there's a couple of books that have sort of collated them together, so you can really get a sense of all the places he performed. So yeah, definitely Sheffield. I'm
going to have to look this guy up now and see which football team he supported as well.
That didn't come through in my research, but you'll have to find out.
I'll check that. Okay, so exploring untold stories from history offers such a rich avenue for discovery, and it's always exciting, I guess, to learn about these figures who inspire not only you, but thousands of other people. Now, with the festive season just around the corner, it's also the perfect time to dive into books that shed more light on these incredible lives. So What other books would you recommend to people in finding out about the lives of Black people through the ages?
So, I mean, I have a lot. I will say I do have a lot. But one of my, I've got two particular ones that I really love. So, this is the Secret Diaries of Charles Ignatius Sancho. This is by the actor Patterson Joseph, and this started as a one-man play. So he was, which I was lucky enough to see in Stratford, where he brings Charles Ignatius Sancho to life. So Sancho was born into enslavement. Managed to free himself under the patronage of the Duke of Montagu in Georgian London, and ended up, he was a composer, he owned his own grocery store, and was one of the, well, actually until recently, we thought he was the first Black man to vote in England. We since found out there was a pub owner who got there a little bit sooner, but it's definitely one of the first Black men to vote in this country. But this book is very much like, it's kind of reminiscent of Charles Dickens or Jane Eyre, you know, when you kind of read those classics that are sort of written in a diarized way, it very much kind of is in that style. And a lot of Sancho's life we know from the letters that he wrote, but Patterson Joseph kind of just builds it into the whole narrative of his life. And it's wonderful, but also really beautiful. I feel like just it's a really beautiful book to gift. So I think this would be amazing. And then my other favorite kids book is this one, which I'll just lean back so you can see it. But this is Brilliant Black History by Atanuke. It's beautifully illustrated by Kingsley Nabechi. And this is kind of for kids. I mean, anyone over the age of sort of 7 or 8, but it goes, you know, from kind of ancient history right up to kind of modern times. But it's just, yeah, it's gorgeous. It's absolutely gorgeous. And yeah, also, if you're an adult and you just don't have time to read a big adult history book, then just go for a kids illustrated one. I mean, it'll be far more entertaining, I'm sure.
And they are really popular, aren't they, the illustrated books? But I guess, you know, that's children like, perhaps they don't have the imagination, but when it's put in front of them, it kind of brings the story alive, doesn't it? You know, much more.
Yeah, although I think that there should be more illustrated books for adults. And I think actually sometimes, you know, when you get beautiful hardback special editions, they sometimes put, you know, more illustrations back in. I think there's this idea that once we get into adulthood, we've sort of left, you know, illustrations behind. And I kind of think the opposite. I'm all for bringing back more illustrations into adult literature.
I've got some, like, obviously history books and things like that, but what they tend to do with the adult side of the book is put either photographs or, you know, artistic works or whatever. They put them in the center.
Yeah, they put everything right in the middle, don't they?
In the middle.
Yeah.
So, and I think, you know, wouldn't it be better, like, if you're talking about a certain period, having an illustration or a picture or whatever, just, you know, just to, it like brings it all together a little bit more, doesn't it? It's not an illustrated book, it's a reading book, but I think the illustrations can be quite important in telling the story, especially if it's a life story, for example, you know. But yeah, so any more magical books that you can think about?
Well, the other one that actually, Joe, I'm just going to grab it because I've got it here. Give me 1 second. So this is actually usually by my bed. So I bought this in October, and this is Black History for Every Day of the Year. This is by David Olusoga. And also, I mean, this is what it looks like inside. But it's just, it's a beautiful book. But essentially every single day of the year, it has a profile on a Black event or a Black movement or a Black individual. And it's a global history. So there are, you know, forgotten kings and queens in Africa. There are references to the civil rights movement in America. It's absolutely brilliant. And I love that on my birthday in here, was the day that Martin Luther King gave his address in Washington. Oh, and I never knew that actually happened on my birthday in sort of 1963. So actually I haven't read all of this. I sort of read October in October, and I'm reading November in November, but I kind of, every couple of days I read a few entries. But I just think it's a really wonderful way of kind of getting little bite-sized snippets of Black history, but also in just like a really stunningly beautiful book as well. Yeah. So yeah, it's
interesting that, because if you didn't know that, I guess that shows what's lacking in some areas then, isn't it? You know, if you didn't know or you were never told, you know, in your childhood or whatever, that nobody actually thought to mention Martin Luther King and
Yeah.
dates and things like that. It's, you know, so you've only just discovered that, and it's took you 40 years to discover that.
Far too
And
long.
it's too long, isn't it?
Yeah, there was a my dad actually shared a lovely article with me a couple of days ago. So there was and I'm trying to remember there was a play that was put on very recently in Swansea in Wales, and it was about the life of a boxer called Cuthbert Taylor, who was a fantastic boxer, but because he was black and it was sort of the earlier 20th century, there existed a colour bar in boxing, so you couldn't represent Britain or fight for the British title unless you had two white parents. So obviously he wasn't allowed. And obviously the play brings his story to life. And the Welsh kids that went were absolutely up in arms, especially the ones that came from the same town that this boxer was born in. They were like, this is absolutely not on. So so I think 300 children have written letters to sort of the Boxing Federation to say, you need to apologize. Like, this is an absolute travesty. And I think the sort of boxing organization has sort of acknowledged that the colour bar was a terrible thing, but still hasn't formally apologized for it. So the kids are like, well, we're going to keep writing you letters because we don't think that's on. But I love that they were inspired by a play. So it was a story they knew nothing about, really identified with this individual, and, you know, are now championing his cause 100 years after the fact. I just think it's amazing.
It's amazing how times have changed, isn't it? In just, I guess, not just in 100 years, but I mean, in every way, shape and form, everything's changed, hasn't it? So dramatically over the last 30 years even. You know, nobody would imagine having a flat screen TV on the wall, would they? Or access to a phone that does virtually everything.
Everything you need and
that you need
everything
to do
you
in
don't
life.
need.
And everything you don't need, exactly. But it's the total different generation. And I think the children today are intelligent enough to see when something has been done wrongly, if you want to put it that way. You know, there's an injustice, I guess, and they see that, and I think that's possibly just the way the generation of today are. You know, they see these things far more than perhaps what they did. Well, clearly than what more they did 100 years ago. What, you know, for example.
Yeah, but I think also it really, for me, it also really highlighted the importance, and it's partly, you know, why I wrote the book, and I'm a big believer that we need more fictional stories in culture about Black British history. Because if you think of all the historical figures that we really know well and that we really take to our hearts, you know, it's people like Henry VIII and Cleopatra and Elizabeth I, because they're always in plays and films. You know, their stories are just constantly around us all the time. So we feel we really get to know them. And I think non-fiction books are great. Let's have as many as possible. But I think it's, you know, it's books like this that really bring those characters to life in a way that you really feel you get to know them. And I think, you know, the children being inspired by a play, perhaps more so than just, you know, learning about it in school, probably just brought that character and the injustice to life in a way that really motivated them. So yeah, that's what I really want to see is, you know, I want Pablo Fanque to have the Greatest Showman treatment. I want there to be, you know, the equivalent of period costume dramas about the reasonable Blackmans and John Blanks of this world, so that we, you know, we get to know these characters really well.
I think we need to get to know them as well. And I understand, I mean, recommending books that uncover these stories is a valuable way to connect people with history. But it also highlights the gap that still exists, which raises the question. There's very little in the way of British Black history that's been recorded over the years. Do you think now is time to change, or is it even possible?
I think it started to change. So I think, you know, compared to 10, 15 years ago, so most of the books that I have in my collection didn't exist 10 years ago. A lot of them didn't exist kind of 5 or 6 years ago. So, you know, things are changing, but not changing fast enough. You know, I had a video that went quite viral, I would say, across a lot of platforms. I'd gone into the British Museum and had gone and looked around the bookshops afterwards, and I couldn't find any books for children on Black British history in the whole of the British Museum. And they have a huge gift shop and 2 kind of bookshop areas. And then I found one for adults. And bearing in mind, they had a whole display of books on cats' role in history. And I'm like, I mean, there were 16 books on the role of cats in history. And I'm like, that's excessive by anyone. So, and I went on a bit of a rant about it, but I also emailed the museum and said, look, I don't think this is good enough. I really don't think this is good enough. And to be fair, I got an email back a few days later saying, no, we acknowledge that we could do a lot better in this area. We don't have enough books and they're not displayed prominently enough. And they said, we're going to be looking at this over the next couple of weeks. Let us know if you have any recommendations. So, of course, I sent them a very long list. But I actually went back. They invited me back to see an exhibition a couple of weeks ago. And they have now, I'd say, an extremely large and comprehensive selection. So not only across children's books, but also adult books. It's certainly all the books I recommended and some. So I was quite surprised, actually. I didn't expect there to be that much of a dramatic change. And I shouldn't have had to call them out on social media. I shouldn't have had to email them in the first place. But the fact that they did respond to that, and I think it's along with a lot of work that they're doing to look at the kind of imperial history of the British Museum and, how they better represent things and how they address things like stolen loot. So there's obviously a lot of other work going on behind the scenes. But that made me think, do you know what? You can change things. You can, even just one person. I've got one quite large institution to stock a huge range of Black history books that will now be on display for anyone who visits. So, there is hope. And I think hopefully things will continue to improve. I do think making Black British history a statutory part of the curriculum is something that just needs to happen, because I think all children need to have access to this history and to these stories. And I think that will also help in terms of, there being a framework and a pipeline for more books on the subject as well, especially for younger readers.
And I think in a society that we have, especially in this country, which is so multiracial, I mean, there are so many different races and everything in this country. It's possibly critical, I guess, to get something in place that not just for the white children, but for everybody. It just to bring it. It's difficult to say, really, but to bring it together, to make it all inclusive. So history in a school, for example, history on one week they could teach Henry VIII, but then the week after they could look at the guy you wrote about. Yeah,
Reasonable Black. Or the other one that kids love learning about is John Black.
And I'm sure that is that the guy with the trumpet? The
and it's because he argued for a pay increase, and I think it's that thing that they, he basically went to Henry VIII and went, "You're not paying me enough, mate," and kind of set out his stall and got his pay doubled. And they, that really captures kids' imagination, because it's a behavior or an action that they can identify with, I guess. Needing some more money, arguing to get more money and succeeding. So I think there is lots of room for these stories. And I think they're a great addition. I think ultimately I'd love us to get to a place where we just talk about British history. And when we say British history, we just mean all of it.
Yeah. And I think that's a really perfect answer really to it, because even though going back to the Tudor times, there wasn't the thing about race in those days. There was no kind of vendetta against anybody else. It was that everybody was as one. And so in some ways, it would be nice to go back to that. Where you can.
Although there was a lot more cholera and dysentery, so
disease aside. But race, the races of people, they came from all over the place.
Yeah.
And there was none of that kind of
Well, I guess you were judged on your class and your status.
Yeah.
You weren't really judged on your skin color. And actually, the third book I want to write will be set in Rome and York, because it was when Severus Septimus, who probably wasn't black in the way that we would consider black now. He was from Northern Africa, but he was an African emperor. But there's quite a lot of evidence that there were darker skinned people from North Africa, but even sub-Saharan Africa in Britain at the time. And again, they didn't have a concept of race. You were entirely judged on your social status or your social standing, and your skin color was considered the same as, someone's eye color or hair color. It wasn't, which it just shows you how much race is a modern social construct. It's not a biological construct, and it certainly wasn't treated as such in Rome and Britain. And I think that I'm quite interested to sort of paint that picture of the past as well. But I need to do a lot more research because my Roman knowledge is not great. So
You'll be all right. You'll get there. Right, I'm going to go completely off history for a moment because I want to ask you something that possibly not many people know about you. Is that you do aerial gymnastics? How did that begin, and why? And I have seen you do it.
Yeah, so I do two things. I do aerial slings, which is sort of a large silk loop that you sort of wind yourself up and down in, and also an aerial hoop. So when I first moved to London, I've been in London for about 20 years, because you can do just about anything in London. I used to try and take up a new hobby every year, or just try it. So, I did roller skiing, I did rock climbing, I've done all kinds of weird and wonderful things, but some things have stuck. And actually it started with pole dancing, not as a profession, just as a hobby. But I did pole dancing for about 8 years, and then that was sort of the gateway to sort of circus. So I started seeing people doing aerial hoop in COVID and became a bit obsessed with it. So I wanted to try it post-COVID, and that's my main form of exercise. It's a lot more fun than going to the gym, I will say.
It just looks absolutely amazing when you do it. And are you double jointed or something? Because you get yourself into all these positions and you're hanging by your feet and then your arms up here and your legs down. And I'm thinking, I'm definitely not. In fact, I'm not for an aerialist. I'm not particularly flexible. For a non-aerialist, it probably looks that way. I'm also very good at filming from angles where it looks like I'm more flexible than I am. So how do you kind of begin doing that? Do you know what I mean? What's the kind of training regime behind it to get you started? Because obviously you're not going to be on 10 feet from the ceiling initially.
No, and I had quite good upper body strength when I started, which definitely helps. But for example, I've got a friend I do aerial slings with who had zero upper body strength when she first started. And you kind of build it up as you learn. And actually, in some ways, being too strong to start with can be a disadvantage, because the danger is you just sort of muscle your way into things without learning the proper technique. And I am definitely guilty of that. But you build it up gradually. And it's a lot of fun. It's a really nice community in terms of the people who do it. And, they're from all walks of life. It's a huge amount of fun. And you get kids classes now, which never used to happen. So, and kids are really annoying because they're so small and light. They can just do crazy stuff from the get-go.
So how long do you stay up there for then? Because does all the blood rush to your head? Because it would to me, I think.
You get used to it, but you don't spend ages hanging upside down. So you're usually transitioning from one thing, and then you pause in the places where it's comfortable to pause quite often. So the problem when you're learning something is sometimes you do end up getting stuck upside down because you can't figure out what comes next, and that does become quite difficult. It does.
I mean, I've watched it. I've watched a couple of videos of you doing it, and it's amazing to see.
It's lovely. It's a lot of fun, and it's very rewarding because you're kind of trying to get a sequence or get a move or get better at something. So yeah, I would encourage everyone to try it at least once. It's ridiculous, but it's a huge amount of fun.
Yeah. Anyway, moving away from all that again, it's now time to talk about Claire. So where can people find out more about you? Any information about this new book, which I think you mentioned a little earlier, and maybe
Yes.
any social media sites you'd like to share?
Yeah, so the best way of following me is probably on Instagram or TikTok. I'm Claire_Linney on both of those platforms. And honestly, but if you Google Time Tub Travelers and the Silk Thief, you'll also find the book and my website. But yeah, I talk about the book on my website. I also on my socials, I also talk about Black British history, but I review a lot of other books, sort of primarily middle grade and young adult books, and mainly by diverse and kind of marginalized authors as well.
Fantastic. Now, don't forget, everybody, all Claire's links will be in that description box below. And with that said, Claire, thank you so much for joining us today and sharing your incredible insights into children's books that bring Black history from Tudor England and beyond to life. It's clear that your passion for uncovering these untold stories and making them accessible to younger generations is truly inspiring. And it's clear also that your work not only educates, but also empowers, shining a much needed light on the rich tapestry of history. So thanks for your dedication and for reminding us all of the importance of inclusivity and representation in literature. It's been an absolute pleasure speaking with you.
It's been wonderful. Thank you so much for inviting me on.
And as always, to everyone who's tuned in, thank you so much. We've still got some more incredible guests coming on History Speaks. So if you love history, you'll love History Roadshow. And don't forget to like, subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss any of our historical stories. So until next time, keep exploring the past with us and we'll see you in the next video. Bye for now.